So, welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome to our lecture series called Daily News and Shorts. In this lecture series, we cover a particular day's current affairs in a very short span of time within 30 minutes. The idea is very simple. We want you to cover your current affairs and we want you to cover them on a daily basis. But we don't want you to spend your entire day covering current affairs. Therefore, we will finish off current affairs, that day's current affairs, within 30 minutes. But the thing is that just watching this lecture would be job half done. Because just after watching it, you need to revise it as well. Why, you ask? Well, revision helps in consolidating these current affairs in your memory. Otherwise, you'll quickly forget them. Now, you can revise these current affairs from our notes, and I think you know this, or you all know this by now. These notes are available on our Telegram channel. Where can you find our Telegram channel? Just below this video in the comment section, you will find a link. Just click on that link. It will take you to our Telegram channel, and from there, you can download the notes for this lecture and do the necessary revision. It would hardly take 15-20 minutes, but these current affairs would be etched in your memory. Alright, enough of the introduction. Let's straight away jump into the discussion. But first, let's take a look at the list of topics that we are going to cover today. So in total, we'll be covering 5 topics. Okay, so here's the list. Flexible FRBM targets. Now recently an article was published in the Hindu newspaper and it argued that Government of India should not follow rigid fiscal deficit targets. As per the FRBM Act, India has to achieve 3% of GDP of fiscal deficit. Okay, India's fiscal deficit should be 3% of GDP, and this is a rigid fiscal target. Okay, now this article argues against the rigidity of this target. This article argues that this target should be a little flexible because sometimes you need to increase fiscal deficit. So we'll talk about that. Then recently, Ministry of Culture launched Global Engagement Scheme. Now, this scheme would showcase India's culture on a global stage. So what is this scheme all about? We'll talk about this. Then, SIPRI, Stockholm Institute of Research in, basically I'm forgetting the full form, but SIPRI Institute, we'll talk about this. Stockholm Peace Research Institute. Okay, so SIPRI is basically a research institute which basically comes out with regular reports on which country is spending more on defense expenditure, which country is importing a lot of armaments, arms and ammunition, which country is exporting a lot of arms and ammunition. So basically it talks about the defense industry, global defense industry. So it has recently come out with its report, and in that report it has talked a bit about India. So we'll talk about this. Then recently Lok Sabha passed bills of lading bill. Now what is lading? What is this bill? We'll talk about this. And in the end, we'll talk about a fascinating news. A biotechnology company of UK, United Kingdom, basically produced gene-edited bananas. So what's so special about these gene-edited bananas? We'll talk about this. All right? Okay then. Let's begin today's discussion starting with topic number 1, and that is flexible FRBM targets. Now look, before the FRBM Act of 2003, governments throughout India's history never used to follow fiscal consolidation. Now, what do you mean by fiscal consolidation? Well, fiscal consolidation basically means that you reduce your fiscal deficit. Now, what is fiscal deficit? I'm sure you know this by now. Fiscal deficit is the amount by which your expenditures, government expenditures, exceed receipts. Now, if this is high, your expenditures are higher than your receipts, then you have to borrow to fulfill those expenditures. Now, higher fiscal deficit adds to debt burden on you. Now, before FRBM Act 2003, governments were very careless when it comes to fiscal consolidation or controlling their fiscal deficit. But after FRBM Act, it was set in law that you have to achieve this fiscal deficit target, 3% of GDP. Your fiscal deficit should be 3% of GDP. Though the government has not been able to achieve this target, but still it is moving in that direction. Clear? And everyone thought that this is a good thing. Okay? Fiscal consolidation is a good thing because it reduces debt burden and brings in more stability, macroeconomic stability to your country. Okay? But this particular article that featured in the Hindu newspaper argues that the fiscal deficit target, no doubt it should be reduced. Fiscal deficit should be reduced. But there should be some flexibility in the target. We shouldn't be that rigid with this target. Okay? And why? Well, they argued that sometimes you need to increase your fiscal deficit. Sometimes you need to relax your fiscal deficit target. Okay? But if you're going to be that rigid, it will be counterproductive. It will harm your economy more. Okay? So FRBM Act mandates that India's fiscal deficit be limited to 3% of GDP. While the rule was introduced to maintain financial stability, the rigidity of this target has unintentionally restricted growth-oriented spending. Because the government is so much focused on reducing its fiscal deficit, it sometimes reduces its expenditure also. Now, bad expenditure you need to reduce, but some expenditures are good expenditures by the government. Some expenditures are growth oriented spending, growth oriented expenditures. Okay. Now, this article basically gave you the pros and cons of fiscal consolidation. Okay. Now, it says that if you follow rigid fiscal deficit targets, if your fiscal deficit target is 3% of GDP, come what may, you will not budge from it. Then what happens? Well, then you have limited policy room. You have limited room. Let's suppose you think of a welfare scheme which you think that is it's really going to benefit India, right? But because you have a rigid fiscal deficit target, you don't have enough resources or money to finance this welfare scheme. So you drop the idea of launching this welfare scheme. Okay? So you drop the idea. Yes? So there is limited policy room. Then what happens is that it's not just the central government that has to follow this target. Even state governments have to follow this target. Okay? Even state governments have to follow 3% of their GSDP, gross state domestic product. Now, thing is that in India, if we talk about both central government and state governments, in India, 60% of total expenditure by the government is incurred by state governments. Okay, all the state governments. So if we take into account all the expenditures done by both central and state governments, 60% of the expenditure is done by the state government. So expenditure requirements of the states are huge, but states have also states have to maintain this target also, right? This is a bit unfair for them. Plus, this word uniform is very important over here. Look, different states in India have different needs. Okay, some states in India like Maharashtra, Gujarat have very good infrastructure, so they don't need to spend that much on infrastructure. But some states in India, especially northeastern states and eastern India, they have huge infrastructure gaps. So they need big infrastructure projects, and for that they need to spend heavily. But because this 3% target for states is uniform, every state has to maintain it. Therefore, these eastern and northeastern states which have huge infrastructure requirements, they also have to maintain it. And therefore, they don't have enough spending resources to finance their infrastructure, right? So at least for these states, there should be some flexibility, right? But we are following this uniform fiscal deficit target for all states, right? And the third, but very important point, okay? This is the biggest disadvantage of very rigid fiscal deficit target. And hear me out carefully. You see, the thing is that governments incur expenditure, but these expenditures are of two types. One is revenue expenditure, and the other is capital expenditure, which is also called capex, short form. Okay. Now, revenue expenditure is all about what do you call it? Salaries for the government employees, subsidies, all these things. Revenue expenditure is all about that. Okay. So if Government of India has taken any loan, it will have to pay interest payments in future. Those interest payments would be part of revenue expenditure. So revenue expenditure, much of revenue expenditure, which includes subsidies, salaries, pensions, interest payments, much of it is committed. You have to incur this expenditure. Okay. Though revenue expenditure is wasteful expenditure, it doesn't boost India's growth, but it is committed. You have to do this expenditure. If you have taken a loan, you have to pay it back, right? So much of revenue expenditure is committed expenditure. Now, the other part is capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is basically expenditure on infrastructure projects. You're building roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, ports, airports. All these things are included in capital expenditure. Now, if you will follow rigid fiscal deficit targets, then what will happen? Much of your revenue expenditure is committed. You have to incur this expenditure. But to achieve this 3% target, you have to reduce your expenditure somehow. So how will you do it? You will reduce your capital expenditure. So government's expenditure is more biased in favor of revenue expenditure, which is not growth boosting. Growth boosting is capital expenditure. So this is being ignored. Right? Makes sense? Now, what are the advantages of flexible fiscal policies? Very simple. counter-cyclical flexibility. Now, what is counter-cyclical? Hear me out carefully. You see, it is said that when your economy is doing well, when your economy is booming, okay, then the government should reduce its fiscal deficit. And how will government reduce its fiscal deficit? Government will increase taxes so that it has more receipts and reduce its expenditure. So when there is a boom, government doesn't need to incur that much expenditure. People are doing well on their own. Now, if people are earning a lot of income, government should increase taxes on them so that government earns enough money to pay off previous debt, right? So during boom, you should reduce your fiscal deficit. But during a recession, people are already suffering. At that moment, you need to reduce tax burden on them. You need to increase your expenditure. Because if you'll reduce tax burden on people, they will have more money. They will use more money to buy things. They will increase demand in the economy and the economy will grow back. If you'll spend more money, if government spends more money on building roads, bridges, government will increase demand for cement, steel. Now, cement, steel industries would start to do well and we will come out of recession. Okay, so during recession, government needs to reduce its taxes, increase its expenditure, increase its fiscal deficit. Now, this entire policy is known as counter-cyclical policy. Why is it called counter-cyclical? Because during boom, you are basically reducing your fiscal deficit. During recession, you are increasing your fiscal deficit. So this is going against the cycle of economy. So this is counter-cyclical. Now, you need flexible fiscal deficit target to conduct this counter-cyclical fiscal policy, because if you are not doing counter-cyclical fiscal policy, then you won't be able to stabilize your economy. If there is a recession, but you are being told that you have to maintain 3% fiscal deficit target, but there is a recession. Now is the time for you to increase fiscal deficit, but you can't because that target is rigid. So you won't be able to bring your economy back to its journey of growth. That is the problem. Okay. Plus, like I said, rigid fiscal deficit targets basically creates uniform state priorities. Some states require more spending than others, right? But if fiscal deficit targets are flexible and flexible for states, well, different states will basically align their fiscal policies according to their own needs, align their fiscal deficit targets according to their own needs. Okay. Plus, if your fiscal deficit target is flexible, you will have more room for capital expenditure. And capital expenditure is growth boosting, not revenue expenditure. Clear? But as per our FRBM Act, we still follow rigid fiscal deficit targets. So what is the way forward? What should we do? There are 5 things that we can do. Okay. First of all, make your fiscal deficit targets flexible, like in USA. Okay. India should not go for 3% rigid fiscal deficit target. India should be 3.5 to 4.5% of GDP. This should be your range. Okay. And you should basically choose your fiscal deficit within this range as per your needs. Then you need to increase your capital expenditure, allocating funds to infrastructure, education, and health to boost growth. Reduce your revenue expenditure and increase your capital expenditure. Then the thing is that some people might say that reducing fiscal deficit is important. Okay, it is important. But spending on capital expenditure is also important. So you need to find alternative ways to fund capital expenditure. Okay, other than your fiscal policy and budget. So you need to create alternative funds, like create a sovereign wealth fund. Government has more than $600 billion of forex reserves. Government can use that to finance infrastructure. Government has so many infrastructure projects which it can sell or lease out to private people, gaining money from that transaction and then financing it for new infrastructure. So search for alternative funds so that your fiscal deficit is also reduced and you can increase your capex. Then, to increase your capex, you need to generate more receipts. And you can generate more receipts by bringing in tax reforms. GST was one such reform, but you need to bring in direct tax reforms also. This would increase tax compliance, would reduce tax evasion, tax avoidance, and expand tax base. And then in the end, bring in transparency. Implementing audits and public report for fiscal accountability, plus audits in infrastructure projects so that there is less room for corruption, so that money doesn't get wasted. So implement these 5 strategies and you will really do well if you really want to make India a developed country by 2047, Vikasit Bharat by 2047. All right, that is all. Okay, now let's quickly move on to topic number 2, which is Global Engagement Scheme. So, Global Engagement Scheme of Ministry of Culture aims to promote India's rich cultural heritage internationally and enhance India's global image. So that is why Ministry of Culture launched this scheme. Under this scheme, we will promote our own culture on a global scale, on a global stage. Okay. The key scheme objectives include strengthening cultural ties with foreign nations so that these foreign nations promote our culture, promote our language, promoting bilateral cultural contacts so that they can promote their culture in India and India can promote India's culture there, projecting India's cultural identity on a world stage. Okay. Now, Ministry of Culture is going to implement this global engagement scheme through Indian missions abroad, Indian embassies abroad. Okay. Now, what are the three major components of this scheme? This global engagement scheme has three major components. Here they are. Okay. First, a program will be launched called Festival of India. Under this Festival of India, India will basically organize cultural events all over the world. Okay. And Indian artists, whether they are musical artists, dance artists, painting artists, Indian artists would get an opportunity to perform. Okay. So this will basically showcase Indian heritage, rich Indian heritage on a global scale. So number one component is Festival of India. The number two component is grant in aid to Indo-foreign friendship cultural societies. Okay. So there are many countries in the world with which India has cultural ties, right? Now, these countries have established many institutions, many organizations that promote their own country's culture and India's culture. So India will provide grants to these institutions in different countries so that they can promote India's culture. So India will provide financial support for cultural societies in different countries. Clear? So they would promote Indian culture. So this is part number 2. And third is contribution grant to international organizations. There are many international organizations, okay, not country-based organizations, international organizations like UNESCO and all. They would also be financed by Government of India. Government would give grants to them so that these organizations, of which India is also a member, these international organizations also promote India's rich heritage. Okay. By the way, in your notes, I have mentioned an extra paragraph. Okay. In that extra paragraph, I have mentioned those organizations of which India is also a member. There are many international cultural organizations that India is a part of. So read about those organizations from your notes. All right. This is all you need to know as far as global engagement scheme is concerned. Clear? Now let's shift to topic number 3, which is arms import SIPRI report. So SIPRI stands for Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Clear? And it is an independent international think tank focused on research in wars, conflict, armaments, arms control, and disarmament. Now, this research institute was established in Stockholm, Sweden. That is why it is called Stockholm Research Institute. Okay, and was established in 1966. Now, almost every 4 years, people all over the world look out for this report because this report tells us who was the largest importer of arms in the world, who was the largest exporter, which country has the biggest share, market share, as far as defense trade is concerned, right? Now, India has been one of the largest importer of arms and armaments all over the world. But this time, in this recent report, Ukraine has surpassed India. So India has become the second largest arms importer after Ukraine. And understandably so, because Ukraine is currently involved in a war with Russia. Ukraine needs all the arms and ammunition it needs to fight the war. So Ukraine has become the number one importer and India is a distant second. Clear? Now, as far as India is concerned, SIPRI report has given us some facts. Okay, so what are the facts with respect to India's imports, arms imports? Okay, now remember, Russia has been traditionally India's largest arms supplier. Okay, so Russia has been the dominant arms supplier. India imports the most from Russia. But the thing is, in recent times, India has started to import from USA as well. India has started to import from other countries as well. Right? That is why, though still Russia is the largest supplier of arms to India, still, but its share has dropped to 36%. Okay? And France is catching up. especially after buying Rafale jets from France and many other submarines from France. Okay, so top supplier is still Russia, but many people think that by the time next SIPRI report comes, well, France would overtake India because India is trying to diversify its imports, okay, or from the countries it buys weapons from. Plus, Russia currently is unable to supply that many weapons because Russia needs those weapons itself. It is fighting a war with Ukraine, right? Now, this is as far as India goes in the SIPRI report. SIPRI report has also talked about the global defense trade. So, what are the facts that SIPRI report has released with respect to global arms trade? So, it says that USA is the largest supplier of arms and armaments in the world. 43% of the global market share is with USA. Okay. Russia's share has declined. At one point of time, Russia was the second largest as far as market share goes in arms trade after USA, but its share has declined to 7.8%. Now, do you know, 4 or 5 SIPRI reports back, China was the largest importer and India used to be the second largest importer. But China has exited the list of top 10 importers. And China is no longer the top 10 importer of arms and ammunition, which is good news for China because that means China has developed its own domestic industry for guns, arms, and ammunition. Okay? India needs to do the same. This is not good news that India is one of the largest importers of these things. India needs to produce these things itself. India should become an exporter. Okay? By the way, Italy is on 6th place. Its share has increased as far as exports are concerned with respect to Italy exports a lot of defense equipment. Europe's imports have increased. Okay? Has been a 155% increase in imports by Europe. Okay, most of it is from USA, and the reason is that Europe feels threatened from Russia. Okay, so this is the reason. And Pakistan has also started buying more weapons, but China has been its major supplier. 81% of the weapons supplied to Pakistan are from China. Basically, some people say that Pakistan is just a vassal state of China. Whatever China says, Pakistan does. Okay, any which way. This is all that we need to cover as far as the SIPRI report is concerned. Now let's shift our focus to topic number 2, which is a very small topic, bills of lading bill. Okay. Now, the thing is, what is lading? You see, lading is loading, offloading of ships when they arrive at ports. So when these ships arrive at ports, they are offloaded or they are loaded with new containers, right? This process is known as lading. Now, this process of lading requires a lot of documentation. It requires a lot of procedures, rules. Now, all these rules were earlier regulated by Indian bills of lading bill. Imagine the date, 1856, that old. So all the rules with respect to documentation of lading, documentations, procedures related to lading were regulated by an archaic law, ancient law, enacted by the colonial establishment. Things have changed dramatically. It has been more than 150 years. Things have changed dramatically from then, right? So we need to update our law as per the new needs. That is why Lok Sabha has passed Bills of Lading Bill 2025. Okay. Now, what does this bill do? This bill basically simplifies the procedures. Okay. Brings this law closer to the global best practices. Because of simplification, it would lead to less legal disputes, right? And more ease of doing business. So this was the purpose. Okay. Key benefits, as you can see in this picture, will streamline shipping processes, will reduce legal disputes, will ensure greater ease of doing business, will strengthen India's role in global trade. All right. Make sense? Now, what will be the benefits of this bill? Well, as you can see from this chart, first of all, it will modernize India's shipping industry because we are going to inculcate global best practices. Global best practices with respect to lading in shipping industry, right? So we will be in tune with how the world is now, not how the world was in 1856. So this will lead to modernization. It will improve ease of doing business. We'll get closer to global best practices. And in this law, Central government's role has increased. Central government can issue directions to states to implement this law better. Okay, so central government's powers have been increased so that this law gets implemented properly. Okay, and India increases its share in the global shipping industry. This would really help India's foreign trade, and foreign trade includes exports also. So this is good news for India's export industry as well. Okay, all right. Now let's move on to the last news item, but definitely not the least. It's a very fascinating news item. Okay, gene edited bananas. Now, what's the news? So there is a biotechnology company called Tropic. Okay, now it has edited the genes of bananas so that bananas do not become brown when you peel them. You know this, that when you cut apples, then the internal side of the apple becomes brown, right? When you peel a banana and you leave it, it becomes brown, it becomes stale, right? These bananas become brown and people don't like to eat them then. Okay, people think it has gone stale, and that is why people throw them away. Yes, now these gene edited bananas can stay as they were when you peeled them for 12 hours. They can stay yellow for 12 hours without browning. This has been done through gene editing. Now you might say, what's the benefit? Okay, how is this beneficial for us? Why did scientists, this UK based biotech company, did so much, spent so much money to do this? How does that even matter that the banana is becoming brown or yellow? Well, it matters, and I'll tell you why. You see, the thing is that globally, 50% of bananas are thrown into the waste because people do not prefer eating brown bananas. Okay, so let's suppose what happens is that when you're harvesting bananas, okay, you there is a cut in the banana, okay, and its internal skin is exposed. Now it starts to become brown. When it starts to become brown, customers don't buy it. That is why the producers throw it away. 50% of the bananas are thrown. Now, this is basically wrong because this is leading to food wastage. And do you know what? Food wastage contributes a lot to greenhouse gases. Okay, so we can save global warming, save on global warming. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we prevent food wastage. And we can start with bananas. So, this gene editing will keep bananas fresh for long, right? It will make them look aesthetically ripe, okay, or fresh, and people won't throw them away. So Tropic, the UK-based biotech company which has developed gene-edited bananas, claims that their fruit remains fresh and yellow for 12 hours after being peeled. Okay? Brown, overripe bananas often end up in dustbins even when they are perfectly edible. Do you know what? When these bananas become brown, we don't eat them. But that doesn't mean that they have become stale. They're perfectly edible. But we don't eat them because it doesn't look nice. Right? That is why so much food is getting wasted. So this research would really help in prevent food wastage. Now the thing is that in your UPSC prelims as well as mains, science related questions are asked. Okay, so to cover for these science related questions in your, especially in your prelims examination, we need to know what is the science behind browning of bananas, right? So it's a very simple process. Okay, the thing is that banana produce ethylene. Ethylene is a hormone. Okay, and when ethylene is produced, ethylene, this hormone is generally produced when you peel a banana. So when you'll peel a banana, ethylene will be produced. Ethylene is a sign that this banana is ripe. Now when this hormone is produced, it activates some genes in the banana. These genes produce PPO enzyme. This PPO enzyme, when comes in contact with the yellow skin of banana and comes in contact with oxygen, because when you'll keep this banana under the peel, it is cut off from oxygen, but when you'll peel it, it'll come in contact with oxygen. So when this PPO comes in contact with oxygen, it turns this yellow color to brown. And when your banana becomes brown, from yellow to brown, more ethylene is produced, more gene activation happens, more PPO is produced, and it quickly becomes stale or looks stale, right? So what has this company done? This company has basically deactivated these genes. So ethylene will be produced, but this won't activate these genes which produce PPO, which make, after interacting with oxygen, make your banana brown. Okay, this is the purpose, and this would really help in containing this 50% wastage, and would also help in our fight against global warming because it would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, this is the advantage, and this is the science behind this. All right. And with that, we conclude today's session. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. And I'm sure you enjoyed the lecture, and I'm sure it has added value to your preparation. But it would add more value if you revise this lecture as well. So go to our Telegram channel and download the notes and spend another 15 minutes revising this lecture. On that note, I'll be signing off. Thank you so much, everyone.